My son. He walked right up to my table in the middle of his own wedding, leaned down and whispered in my ear, "Mom, I need you to leave. Ella's uncomfortable with you being here." I had just given them $15,000 to pay for that whole affair. $15,000 that I took straight out of my retirement savings. And my son, the boy I raised all by myself for 26 years, the boy I breastfed, the one I carried in my arms when he had a fever, the one I put through college by working double shifts as a nurse. That very same son was kicking me out of his wedding because his new bride was uncomfortable with me being there. I looked around that ballroom. Tables decorated with white flowers, waiters in white gloves serving champagne, a band playing soft jazz, 300 people celebrating. And me, the groom's mother, had been stuck at table 14, way in the back, near the kitchen door, along with some hotel staff who didn't even know Jordan. And you know what the worst part was? When I looked for Ella in that crowd of people, she was looking right at me, from across the room, with that little smirk on her face, that victorious little smirk, like she'd just won a war I didn't even know I was fighting. In that moment, I understood everything. Everything. The 6 months she lived in my house without paying a single penny, the questions she'd ask about the family property, the way she slowly, surely pushed Jordan away from me. It wasn't a coincidence, it was a strategy. But what my son didn't know, what Ella surely didn't know, what nobody in that fancy Charlotte ballroom knew, is that they had just gone and picked a fight with the wrong woman. 3 weeks after that night, I was sitting in a lawyer's office, pen in hand, about to sign the papers that would tear more than $1 million out of my son's life. $1,200,000 to be exact. 40 acres of land that had been in my family since 1952. Land that my granddaddy, a black veteran of World War II, bought with the sweat of his own brow. Land that Jordan and Ella wanted to turn into some luxury condo development. And I didn't tremble. I didn't cry. I didn't hesitate for one single second. My name is Monique Williams. I'm 67 years old. I'm black. I'm retired. And I live in a little speck of a town in North Carolina that most people don't even know exists. And this is the story of how my only son tried to rob me, and how I destroyed his plans. But for you to understand how we got to this point, I need to go back a bit. I need to tell you who I am, where I come from, and most important, I need to tell you about this land. Because this land isn't just dirt, it's blood, it's sweat, it's history, it's everything my family fought to have in a country that did everything it could to make sure we had nothing. My granddaddy's name was James Williams. He was born in 1920, a time when being a black man in the American South meant you were treated as less than human. He grew up in a sharecropper family, working someone else's land since he was 6 years old, picking cotton, planting tobacco, breaking his back under a sun that would split rocks, earning next to nothing, with no rights to speak of. When the Second World War started, my granddaddy enlisted. He was 21 years old and figured if he fought for his country would finally see him as a citizen. He fought in Europe, saw terrible things, lost friends, nearly died twice, and when he came back home with medals on his chest and nightmares in his head, you know what happened? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. He was still a black man in the American South, still had to drink from a separate water fountain, sit in the back of the bus, lower his head when a white man walked by. The medals didn't mean a thing. The sacrifice didn't mean a thing, at least not in the eyes of white America. But my granddaddy, he didn't give up. He made a promise to himself. One day he was going to own a piece of land that was his. A place where nobody could tell him what to do, where he could walk with his head held high, where he could raise his children without fear. He worked 2 jobs for 12 years, 12 long years. By day, he was a bricklayer. By night, he cleaned offices, slept 4, maybe 5 hours a night, saved every single penny he had left over, didn't buy new clothes, didn't go anywhere, didn't spend a dime on anything that wasn't essential. In 1952, he had $3,000. And with those $3,000, he bought 40 acres of land in North Carolina. I still remember the story my daddy used to tell me, about how my granddaddy came home that day with the deed in his hand and just wept. A man who'd fought in a war, who'd seen death and destruction. A man who never cried about anything. He cried like a child holding that piece of paper. Because that wasn't just land. It was freedom. It was dignity. It was proof that they hadn't managed to break him. My granddaddy built a house on that land with his own 2 hands, brick by brick, board by board. He planted trees that still give shade on the porch today, dug a well that still gives clean water. He raised my daddy right there, taught him to love that ground, to respect that history. When my granddaddy passed in 1978, he left the land to my daddy, and he made him promise one thing: never sell. Never. No matter what happened, no matter how much money they offered, that land had to stay in the family. It was our legacy. It was the proof of everything they'd survived. My daddy kept that promise his whole life. He went through hard times, had times where he barely had enough money for food, but he never ever considered selling 1 inch of that land. And when he passed in 1995, the land came to me, along with that very same promise. I was already married to Joseph by then. We were living in a little house in Charlotte, where I was working as a nurse. When I inherited the property, we decided to move out here. Joseph quit his job. We packed up Jordan, who was about 6 years old at the time, and we went to start our lives over on the land of my ancestors. Joseph loved this place from the first day. He'd grown up in the city, but he discovered a passion for farming he never even knew he had. He planted a vegetable garden, raised some chickens, fixed up the old barn my granddaddy had built. He used to say it was the only place he could really breathe. Jordan grew up running all over those 40 acres, playing in the creek, climbing the trees, fishing in the pond my daddy had dug. He knew every corner of that land, every path, every rock, every tree. I thought he loved it as much as I did, as much as his daddy, his granddaddy, and his great-granddaddy did. I thought he understood what it all meant. When Joseph died, 14 years ago now, it was on the porch of that house that I sat and cried. It was looking out at that land that I found the strength to carry on. And it was right there that I made a promise. Just like my granddaddy, just like my daddy, that land would stay in the family, whatever it took. Jordan was 23 when his father died. He was in his last year of college, a college I paid for working double shifts with no help from anyone. He took the loss hard. Joseph was his hero, his role model, his best friend. For months, Jordan could barely function, but he recovered. He graduated, got a job, started moving up in his career. I saw my son turning into a successful man, and I was so proud. I felt like all the sacrifices had been worth it, that the family legacy was safe in his hands. Then he met Ella. Now I need to be fair here. I'm not one of those mothers-in-law who thinks no woman is good enough for her son. I'm not. I always wanted Jordan to find someone to love, to build a family with. I always prayed for him to be happy. But Ella, from the very first moment, there was something about her that just rubbed me the wrong way. Something I couldn't quite put my finger on, but it made my stomach turn every time she walked into a room. She was beautiful. I can't deny that. Tall, thin, hair always perfect, designer clothes, flawless makeup. The kind of woman who turns heads when she walks by. But there was an emptiness in her eyes, a coldness, like she was always calculating, always measuring, always sizing up what every person and everything was worth. When Jordan introduced her to me about 2 years ago, I made an effort to be friendly. I opened my home to her, fixed a special supper, tried to really get to know her. I asked about her family, her job, her dreams, and she answered everything with short, polite answers, but with no warmth, no connection, and she asked questions, so many questions, about the property, about the land, about how much it was worth, about if I ever planned on selling. At the time, I just figured it was curiosity. Now I know it was research. 6 months before the wedding, Jordan called me with that tone of voice I knew from his teenage years. The tone he used when he wanted something he knew I wasn't going to like. He explained that Ella had lost her job and they were having a hard time paying for their apartment in Charlotte. He asked if she could stay at my house for a little while, and I said yes. Of course I did. She was my son's fiancée. What was I going to do? Say no? Ella moved into my house the very next day. showed up with 3 huge suitcases full of clothes and a shoebox collection that looked like it had no end. I fixed up the guest room for her, put out fresh flowers, clean towels, did everything I could to make her feel welcome. And you know how she thanked me. The first day, she complained the mattress was too firm. The second day, that the shower didn't have enough pressure. The third, that the food I made was too heavy for her taste. Within a week, she'd criticized just about everything in my house, from the curtains to the way I organized the pantry. But I swallowed it. I took a deep breath, counted to 10, and reminded myself it was temporary. She'd be gone soon, and everything would go back to normal. Except she didn't leave. The days turned into weeks. The weeks turned into months. Ella didn't look for a job. She didn't help with a single thing around the house. She didn't contribute 1 red cent. She spent her days in her room on her phone, or she'd go out shopping with Jordan's credit card. She'd come back with bags from expensive stores, parade her new purchases through the living room, and never, not once, even offer to wash a dish. And with every week that passed, she asked more questions about the land. Specific questions. What's the price per acre in this area? Have you ever thought about selling off a piece? What would you do with the money if you sold? I always gave her the same answer. I'm not selling. This land stays in the family. It's a promise. And she'd just smile that little smirk of hers and change the subject. 3 weeks before the wedding, Jordan called me again. His voice was strange, kinda sheepish, a little embarrassed. He explained that the wedding had gotten more expensive than they'd planned and asked if I could help out with $15,000. $15,000. I was quiet for a long time. My retirement isn't much. After 40 years working as a nurse, I get enough to live with dignity, but there's not a lot left over. The money I had saved up was my 401k, my safety net, my guarantee in case I got sick, needed some expensive treatment, some emergency. But it was for my only son's wedding, the boy I'd raised by myself, the man I thought would honor our family's legacy. I went to the bank the next day. I withdrew the $15,000. I felt a tightness in my chest when I saw that number leave my account. But I convinced myself it was an investment in Jordan's future, in his happiness. If I had known what was going to happen at that wedding, I would have kept every single cent. I would have said no. I would have protected my money like I should have protected my heart. But I didn't know. So I bought a new dress, spent more than I should have to look nice, and drove 4 hours to Charlotte, thinking I was going to celebrate the best day of my son's life. And instead, I was kicked out of the party like I was a stranger, an intruder, a problem that needed to be removed. When I left that hotel, head held high but with my heart in pieces, I still didn't know what was coming next. I didn't know that being kicked out of the wedding was only the beginning. I didn't know that in less than 24 hours, my phone would ring and my son would ask for something that would reveal who he had truly become. I drove the 4 hours back home crying so hard I had to pull over at a gas station to compose myself. I washed my face, took a deep breath, looked at myself in the mirror and said, "You are strong, Monique. You've survived worse than this." But I didn't know, in that moment, that the worst was yet to come. I got home in the middle of the night, sat on the porch, the same porch where my granddaddy used to sit, where my daddy taught me to count the stars, where Joseph asked me to marry him. I looked out at that land bathed in moonlight and found a little bit of peace. I went to bed exhausted, with a heavy head and a broken heart. The next morning, as the sun came up and I was still trying to process everything that had happened, my cell phone rang. It was Jordan. I answered. And the first thing my son said, in that casual voice, as if the night before had never happened, was this: "Mom, hey, quick question. Can you send me the property papers?" The property papers, the 40 acres, my family's legacy. And then he started to explain the plan. Ella's uncle was a real estate developer. They had a wonderful project, a luxury condo development that would generate $5, maybe $7 million in profit. And they were willing to give me a piece of it, a few $100,000. And they'd even already picked out a wonderful retirement home for me to move into. It was called Golden Meadows. I was going to love it. My son was offering me peanuts and a nursing home in exchange for 70 years of family history, in exchange for my granddaddy's sweat, my daddy's tears, the promises I had made on my husband's deathbed, and he called it a smart investment. It was in that moment, hearing my own son talk about destroying everything our family had built as if it was just business, that I understood the truth. Ella hadn't stolen my son from me. She had revealed who he really was, a man who measured everything in dollars, a man who would trade his own mother for a good profit. And I made a decision. If my son wanted a war, he was going to get one. But this war, I was going to win. You know that feeling when you get sucker punched in the stomach? When all the air rushes out of you at once and you're just left there, paralyzed, trying to remember how to breathe? Well, that's exactly how I felt listening to my son talk about turning his great-granddaddy's land into a luxury condo complex. I was still holding the phone to my ear, sitting in my kitchen, looking out the window at the trees my granddaddy planted. And Jordan just kept talking, on and on and on. Like he'd rehearsed this speech, you know? Like it was a business presentation he'd prepared all night. He explained that Ella's uncle, a fella named Richard, was a very successful real estate developer in the Charlotte area. Had built I don't know how many buildings, I don't know how many developments, had a flawless reputation in the market. And this Richard character had seen pictures of our property and was, in Jordan's words, absolutely fascinated by the potential. Potential. My son used the word potential to describe 70 years of our family's history. Then he started describing the project. A luxury condo complex with 24 units, 3- and 4-bedroom homes with a swimming pool, a gym, a clubhouse, all surrounded by a high wall with a guard at the gate. The kind of place rich folks buy to feel special, you know? To have a fancy address to put on their business cards. And the best part, according to Jordan, was the profit. He said the numbers with an excitement that made me sick to my stomach. $5 to $7 million. That's what the project would generate. $5 to $7 million. And they were willing to give me a piece. A fair slice for my initial investment, as he called it. I finally managed to open my mouth. I asked how much this fair slice would be. And you know what my son said? He said they were thinking somewhere between $200,000 and $300,000, depending on how the sales went. I did the math in my head. $300,000 out of a $7 million profit, less than 5%, for the land that had been in my family since before Jordan was even born, for the land his great-granddaddy bought with 12 years of back-breaking labor, for the land where his own father was buried, 5%. But Jordan didn't stop there. Oh no. He kept going, getting more and more excited, like he was doing me the biggest favor in the world. Said they'd already researched retirement homes in the area and found a perfect one for me. Golden Meadows, it was called. About 40 minutes away, had private rooms, a 24-hour nurse, recreational activities, everything a lady my age could possibly want. A lady my age. My son, the boy I raised, was calling me a lady my age, and shoving me toward a nursing home like I was a piece of old furniture that needed to be cleared out before the renovations. I took a deep breath, counted to 10. I tried to stay calm, because I knew if I blew up right then, I'd say things I couldn't take back. And despite everything, despite all the anger and all the hurt, a part of me still wanted to believe there was some mistake, that my son couldn't be serious, that at any moment he was going to laugh and say it was all a joke. But he didn't laugh. He kept talking about how the real estate market was hot, about how it was the perfect time to sell, about how I was sitting on a gold mine without even realizing it. He used that phrase, a gold mine, as if the land where 3 generations of my family were born, lived, and died was just an investment waiting to be cashed in. I asked him, in the calmest voice I could manage, if he'd forgotten the promise my granddaddy made, that my daddy made, that I made, to never sell that land, to keep it in the family, no matter what. And you know what Jordan said? He sighed, like I was some stubborn child who just didn't get it. And he said, "Mom, that was a different time. Grandpa and Dad, they didn't have the opportunities we have now. This is business. You can't let sentimentality get in the way of a smart investment." Sentimentality. He called our family's history sentimentality. Right then and there, something inside of me broke. It wasn't my heart, no. My heart had already broken the night before at the wedding. This was something else. It was the last little shred of hope I had that my son was still the boy I knew. That hope died right there, on that phone call, while he talked about profits and investments, like I was a stranger trying to get in the way of his business deal. I said no. I told him I wasn't selling the land, wasn't signing any papers, wasn't moving to any nursing home. I said that land was mine and it was going to stay mine until the day I died. And when I died, it would go to someone who deserved it, someone who understood the value of what it represented. Jordan was quiet for a few seconds. I could almost hear him processing the information, calculating his next move. Then his voice changed. It got colder, harder. He said I was being difficult, that I was sabotaging his future, that I was selfish for wanting to sit on a pile of dirt while he was struggling to build a life. I almost laughed. Almost. My son, who had a job that paid over $100,000 a year, who lived in a luxury apartment in Charlotte, who drove a brand new BMW, who just spent Lord knows how much on a fancy wedding. That same son was calling me selfish because I wouldn't hand over the family inheritance for him to squander. I asked about the BMW, asked how much it cost, and Jordan hesitated before he answered, said it was none of my business, but that he got a good deal. I pushed him, asked if it was financed. He said yes. Everybody finances cars these days. It was no big deal. I asked about the credit card debt. I knew it existed because Ella, in the 6 months she lived in my house, had let a few things slip. Complaints about bills, about interest rates, about living tight, despite Jordan's high salary. My son got defensive, said I was changing the subject, that his finances had nothing to do with the proposal he was making. But I'd already figured it out. Jordan and Ella weren't living within their means. They were burning through money they didn't have, racking up debt, maintaining a lifestyle they couldn't afford. And now they wanted my land to solve the problems they'd created for themselves. I told him so, in no uncertain terms. I said I wasn't selling my family's legacy to pay off the debts he and his wife had run up buying things they didn't need. I said if they were in financial trouble, the solution was to cut back, sell the BMW, move to a cheaper apartment, not to destroy 70 years of family history. Jordan exploded. He started yelling into the phone, accusing me of things I didn't even know he thought. Said I'd always preferred the land to him, that I loved those trees and that creek more than my own son, that I was choosing a pile of dirt over his happiness. And in the middle of his tirade, I heard a voice in the background, Ella's voice. She'd been there the whole time, listening to the conversation, probably coaching Jordan on what to say. And she said something I couldn't quite make out, but from Jordan's reaction, I knew it was an order. He stopped yelling all of a sudden and took a deep breath. When he started talking again, his voice was controlled again, cold, calculated. He said I had 72 hours to think about their proposal, that Ella's uncle needed an answer by Friday because he had other projects lined up, that if I didn't accept, they'd have to explore other options. Other options. I asked him what that meant, and my son, the boy I nursed, the boy I held in my arms, the boy I raised all by myself for 26 years, that boy said, in a voice I didn't recognize, "Mom, you're 67 years old. You live alone in the middle of nowhere. How long do you think you can keep this up? Eventually, someone's going to have to make decisions for you. I'd rather we do this the easy way. Someone's going to have to make decisions for you." He was threatening me. My own son was suggesting that if I didn't agree to the sale, he'd try to have me declared incompetent. He'd try to take control of my own life, my own property. He'd treat me like a senile old woman who didn't know what was best for her. I hung up the phone without another word. I couldn't speak, couldn't even breathe right. I just sat there in the kitchen, staring at the phone in my hand, trying to process what had just happened. My son had kicked me out of his wedding. He'd called me the next day to ask for the family land. And when I said no, he'd threatened me with a conservatorship, all in less than 24 hours. I stood up slowly, my legs shaken, and went out to the porch. I needed air. I needed to see the land, to feel the ground under my feet, to remember what I was fighting for. I sat in the rocking chair Joseph made for me, all those years ago, and looked out at the horizon. The 40 acres stretched as far as the eye could see. The trees my granddaddy planted, huge now, shading the pasture. The red barn my daddy built, a little faded by time, but still standing strong. The creek that cut through the property, glittering in the morning sun. And further out, on top of the little hill on the east side of the property, was Joseph's headstone. My husband was buried there, on that land he loved so much. The last thing he asked of me, on his deathbed, was that I never sell it, that I protect this place, that I honor the sacrifice of those who came before us. The tears started falling before I even realized it. I cried right there, all alone, on that porch that had seen so much history. I cried for the son I'd lost, for the man he'd become, for the family I thought we were, but maybe never truly had been. But you know what's funny? As I cried, as the pain ripped through my chest, something else started to grow inside of me, something I hadn't felt in a long, long time. Anger. A cold, calculated, determined anger. It wasn't the kind of anger that makes you scream and break things. It was the kind of anger that makes you think, that makes you plan. That makes you look at your enemy and calculate exactly how to destroy them. Jordan thought I was a weak old woman. He thought he could pressure me, threaten me, shove me into a nursing home while he destroyed everything my family had built. He thought I'd just give in, because that's what old ladies did. They gave in, they gave up. They let the younger folks take over. But he'd forgotten one thing. He'd forgotten whose daughter I was, whose granddaughter I was. He'd forgotten that the blood running through my veins was the same blood as a man who survived war, poverty, and racism and still managed to buy 40 acres of land with his own 2 hands. I wasn't going to give in. I wasn't going to give up. I wasn't going to let my son and that woman destroy my family's legacy, but I wasn't going to be stupid either. Jordan had a plan. He had Ella whispering in his ear. He had the developer uncle with money and lawyers. He had the willingness to have me declared incompetent if he had to. I couldn't just say no and hope they'd go away. I needed a plan, too, a better plan than theirs. I got up from the rocking chair, wiped my tears, and went inside. I went to the little office Joseph used to use, where we kept all the important documents. I opened the file drawer and pulled out the folder with the property deed. There it was. The document that proved that land was mine. 40 acres, registered in my name since 1995, when my daddy died. I looked at the signatures, the stamps, the registration numbers, all in order, all legal. Nobody could take that from me without my permission. But what if Jordan managed to have me declared incompetent? What if he got some doctor to say I had dementia, that I couldn't make decisions, that I needed a guardian? The law allowed for that. I knew of cases where children had done exactly that to their parents, taken control of the finances, sold off property, put their elderly parents in homes against their will. I was not going to let that happen. Not to me, not to my land. I picked up the phone and called the only person I trusted completely, my younger sister, Dolores. She lived in Raleigh, about 2 hours away, and we talked every week. Dolores is 5 years younger than me, was a schoolteacher her whole life, and is the most level-headed person I know. When she answered, I just broke down. I told her everything. The wedding being kicked out, Jordan's phone call, the proposal, the threat. I cried again while I talked, but this time was different. This time, someone was listening. Someone was on my side. Dolores was quiet for a long time after I finished. I could almost hear her processing it all, organizing her thoughts. Then she let out a long sigh and said something that took me by surprise. She said, "Monique, I always knew that woman was trouble, from the very first day, but I didn't want to say anything because it was your son, and you seemed so happy about the engagement." She'd seen it too. She'd felt the same thing I'd felt when I first met Ella, but she'd kept quiet, so she wouldn't hurt my feelings. I asked Dolores what I should do, and she didn't hesitate. She said I needed a lawyer. A good one. A real one, who understood real estate law and family law, someone who could protect the land and protect me from whatever Jordan was planning. She gave me the name of a lawyer she knew, Patricia Albright, worked out of Durham, had an excellent reputation, and specialized in exactly these kinds of cases. Dolores said she'd call her first, explain the situation, and see if she could get me in to see her urgently. I hung up the phone feeling a little better. Not much, but a little. At least I wasn't alone anymore. At least I had someone on my side, someone to help me think, someone to remind me I wasn't crazy. The rest of that day passed in a blur. I tried to eat something, but I couldn't. I tried to watch television, but I couldn't pay attention. Every time the phone rang, my heart jumped, thinking it was Jordan again. But it was just telemarketers, people trying to sell me insurance or a new credit card. That evening, I went out to Joseph's grave. I took some fresh flowers from the garden and sat on the little stone bench I'd put there years ago. I told him what was happening. I told him about Jordan, about Ella, about the threat. I apologized for not raising our son better, for failing in some way I still didn't understand. And I asked for strength. I asked Joseph and God and the universe and whoever else was listening. I asked for the strength to face what was coming, because I knew it was going to be hard. I knew Jordan wasn't going to give up easy. I knew this battle was just getting started. That night, I barely slept. I lay awake until the early hours, staring at the ceiling, thinking through all the possibilities, all the scenarios, all the ways things could go wrong. But I also thought about the ways things could go right. I thought about the lawyer Dolores had recommended. I thought about strategies, protections, ways to shield the land from any attack. And for the first time since this whole mess started, I felt a little glimmer of hope. Small, fragile, but real. The next morning, bright and early, Dolores called me. The lawyer had gotten back to her. Patricia Albright could see me that very afternoon, at 3 o'clock, in her office in Durham. It was urgent, she'd said. The sooner we acted, the better. I took a shower, put on my best clothes, and hit the road. An hour-and-a-half drive to Durham, listening to gospel music on the radio to try to calm my nerves, praying under my breath in the quiet parts, asking for guidance, protection, wisdom. When I got to the lawyer's office, I was shaken, not from fear, from anticipation, from an anxiety to know if there was a way out, if there was a way to protect the land, if there was hope. The secretary greeted me with a kind smile and led me to a conference room. A few minutes later, the door opened and Patricia Albright walked in. She was a black woman, probably in her 50s, with short-cut gray hair and thin-rimmed glasses. She had a strong presence, you know? The kind of person who walks into a room and you immediately know she's competent, that she knows what she's doing. She shook my hand, sat down in the chair across from me, and said in a firm but gentle voice, "Mrs. Williams, your sister told me a little bit about the situation, but I want to hear it from you, from the beginning. Don't leave anything out." And I told her. I told her everything. From the day I met Ella to Jordan's phone call with the threat. I talked for almost an hour without stopping, while the lawyer took notes on a yellow legal pad. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, rereading her notes. Then she looked up and met my eyes with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. She said, "Mrs. Williams, I'm going to be honest with you. What your son is trying to do is not uncommon. Children trying to take control of their elderly parents' assets. I see it every week in this office. But that doesn't mean they're going to succeed. There are ways to protect yourself, legal, definitive ways that are proof against any maneuver." My heart started beating faster. I asked what those ways were, and the lawyer smiled. For the first time since she'd walked in the room, she smiled. And she said one word that would change everything. Trust. A trust. An irrevocable conservation trust. She explained how it worked. If I donated the land to a conservation trust, it would be protected forever. No one could sell it, develop it, or build anything on it. It would remain as rural, preserved, untouched land. And most important, it would be removed from my will. Jordan would have no claim to it. Not him, not Ella, not their creditors, not anyone. It was irrevocable, she stressed. Once it was signed, there was no going back. The decision would be permanent, definitive, forever. I asked if that meant I would lose the land too, if I'd have to leave my home, the place where I'd lived my whole life, and she shook her head. "No," she said. "I could continue to live there for the rest of my life. I could use the land just as I always had. The only difference was that I couldn't sell it, and when I died, it would go to the trust, not to my heirs, not to my heirs, not to Jordan." I was quiet for a long time, processing that. The lawyer waited patiently, without pushing me. Finally, I asked how long it would take to do this, to create the trust and transfer the land. She said that if I wanted to, she could have the documents ready in a week, maybe less. It depended on how fast I could get all the necessary paperwork together. 1 week. In 1 week, I could protect the land forever. I could make sure that the sacrifice of my granddaddy, my daddy, my husband, had not been in vain. I could honor the promise I had made, but it also meant disinheriting my son. It meant taking away something he expected to receive. It meant declaring, in a definitive and irreversible way, that I no longer trusted him. It was a huge decision, the biggest decision of my life. The lawyer must have seen the hesitation on my face because she leaned forward and said something I'll never forget. She said, "Mrs. Williams, I know a lot of women like you. Women who worked their whole lives, who sacrificed everything for their children, who did everything right, and who now, in their old age, are being treated like obstacles, like problems to be solved. You are not a problem. You are a person, and you have the right to protect what is yours." I felt the tears welling up again. But this time, they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of relief, of gratitude, of being seen. Someone was seeing me. Someone was hearing me. Someone was on my side. I looked at the lawyer, took a deep breath, and said, "Let's do it. Let's protect the land." She nodded, made a few more notes, and said she'd start preparing the documents immediately. She asked me to bring her the deed, the tax records, any document related to the property. The more information, the better. I left her office feeling different, lighter somehow, like a huge weight had been lifted from my shoulders. I was still sad, still angry, still mourning the son I had lost, but now I had a plan. Now I had a way to fight back. I drove back home with the sun setting on the horizon. The fields of North Carolina passed by my window, golden in the late afternoon light. Beautiful, peaceful, mine. When I got home, my phone showed 3 missed calls from Jordan and a text message from Ella. It just said, "We need to talk. This is getting out of hand." I stared at that message for a long time. I thought about replying, about telling them what I was planning, about warning them that they'd already lost, but I decided against it. They'd find out in due time, when the documents were signed, when it was too late to do anything about it. I deleted the message without replying. I turned off my phone, and I went to sleep. But the battle was far from over, because in the next 2 weeks, Jordan and Ella were going to do everything they could to stop me. They were going to call, send messages, show up at my door. They were going to cry, beg, threaten. They were going to try every trick in the book to make me change my mind, and I was going to have to stand firm. I was going to have to hold to my decision, no matter how much it hurt, no matter how much my heart begged me to give in. Because sometimes loving someone means letting them go, and sometimes protecting what's right means losing what you love most. You know what happens when you ignore a person who's used to getting everything they want? They lose their mind. They go crazy. They completely lose all sense of boundaries. That's exactly what happened with Jordan and Ella in the weeks that followed my meeting with the lawyer. The day after my visit to Patricia Albright's office, I woke up early, had my coffee, and went to organize the paperwork she'd asked for. The deed, tax records, old documents, everything I could find related to the property. I spent the whole morning in Joseph's office, rummaging through drawers I hadn't opened in years, dusting off folders yellowed with age. And while I was doing it, my cell phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Jordan, Ella, Jordan, Ella, Jordan again. One call after another. I let every single one go to voicemail. There was nothing they could say that I wanted to hear. Not right then. Not while I was still gathering my strength for what was to come. Around mid-morning, the calls stopped. I thought they'd given up, at least for a while, that they'd understood I needed space. But I was wrong. About 2 hours later, I heard a car pulling onto my property. The sound of tires on the gravel driveway getting closer and closer. My heart started pounding. I knew who it was before I even looked out the window. Jordan's black BMW parked right in front of my house. He got out of the driver's side. Ella got out of the passenger's side. And the two of them came marching toward my front door like they owned the place. I took a deep breath, closed my eyes for a second, and prayed for strength. Not to fight, to stay calm, to not let them throw me off balance. Jordan knocked on the door before I could even decide if I was going to open it. He knocked hard, 3 times, like he was impatient, like I was making him wait. I opened it. He looked different. His face was red, his eyes were puffy, his hair was a mess, looked like he hadn't slept right. Ella, next to him, was impeccable as always. Perfect makeup, designer clothes, that little smirk on her face that I hated so much. But there was something in her eyes, too. Something hard, calculated, dangerous. Jordan started talking before I could say a word. He said we needed to talk, that things had gotten out of control, that this wasn't how he wanted it to be. His voice was a mix of irritation and desperation, like he couldn't decide which emotion to pick. I just stood there in the doorway, without inviting them in. I crossed my arms and waited. Then Ella stepped forward. She put her hand on Jordan's arm, like she was calming him down, and looked at me with that fake, concerned expression she'd practiced so well. She said she understood that I was hurt, that the wedding had been stressful for everyone, that maybe things hadn't been communicated in the best way, but that now it was time to put emotions aside and think about the future, the family's future. Family. She used that word. Like I was part of her family. Like she hadn't just kicked me out of my own son's wedding. I asked her, in the calmest voice I could manage, what future she was picturing, and she smiled. That snake-like smile that gave me chills. And she started talking about the project again. About the condos, about the millions of dollars, about how good it would be for everyone. She said she'd talked to her Uncle Richard and that they were willing to raise my cut. $400,000. $400,000 guaranteed, plus a percentage of future profits. It was a generous offer, she said. An offer I'd be a fool to refuse. $400,000. They'd raised the offer by $100,000 in less than 48 hours, which told me they were desperate, that they needed my signature more than they were letting on. I looked at Jordan, looked him right in the eye, and I asked him if this was what he really wanted, if he really wanted to destroy the land his great-granddaddy bought with 12 years of labor, if he really wanted to disrespect the memory of his father, who was buried less than 500 yards from where we were standing. Jordan looked away. For a second, just 1 second, I saw something in his eyes. Shame, maybe, or guilt, but it was only for a second, because Ella squeezed his arm, and when he looked back at me, his expression had changed. It had hardened. He said his father would have understood. That Joseph was a practical man, who knew the value of money, who would have approved of the project if he were alive. I nearly choked. Joseph? Approve of destroying the land he loved more than anything in the world? Joseph, who spent the last years of his life caring for that property like it was an extension of his own body? Joseph, who made me promise on his deathbed that I would never sell? I told Jordan he didn't know his father, that if he thought Joseph would have approved of this, then he'd never paid attention to a single thing his father ever taught him, and that I wasn't going to argue anymore. The answer was no. N-O, and they could get off my property. Ella lost her composure for a moment. The smile vanished, her eyes narrowed, and I saw the real woman behind the mask. She started talking, but it wasn't that sweet, manipulative voice anymore. It was a hard, aggressive voice. She said I was being irrational, that I was letting old emotions blind me to a golden opportunity, that I was going to die alone in this old house, surrounded by land that was worthless if it wasn't developed. And then she said something that froze my blood. She said, "You know what? Maybe Jordan's right. Maybe you're not capable of making these decisions anymore. Maybe we need to get a professional involved to assess your mental state." Mental state. She had just threatened to have me declared incompetent to my face, on my own front porch, as if I was some kind of fool who wouldn't understand what she was implying. I looked at her, looked deep into that woman's eyes, and I said, with all the calm in the world, "Get off my property, now, before I call the sheriff." Jordan tried to step in, said it didn't have to be like this, that we could talk like adults, that I was overreacting. But I was done. I went inside and shut the door in both of their faces. They stayed out there for another 10 minutes. I could hear them arguing, Ella's voice getting louder and louder, Jordan trying to calm her down. Then finally, the sound of a car starting, tires on gravel, the engine fading into the distance. When the silence returned, I just collapsed. I sat on the living room floor, leaning against the door, and I cried. I cried from anger, from fear, from sadness. I cried for the son I had lost, for the man he had become, for the daughter-in-law who was more snake than human. But you know what's funny? As I cried, a part of me was more determined than ever, because now I had seen it. I'd seen who Ella really was. I'd seen how far she was willing to go. And that just made me even more certain that I was doing the right thing. In the days that followed, the floodgates really opened. First, it was the text messages, dozens of them. From Jordan, from Ella, even from numbers I didn't recognize. Some were pleading, full of words like family, love, future. Others were threatening, talking about lawyers, lawsuits, consequences. I read every one, but I didn't answer a single one. Then came the emails. Ella sent a long, formal email explaining the proposal in detail. It had numbers, charts, profit projections. Looked like an investment prospectus, not a family communication. At the end, she said I had until Friday to give a final answer, or they would be forced to take legal action. Legal action. She loved that phrase. I called my lawyer as soon as I read it. Patricia Albright listened calmly to everything and told me not to worry. That threats were common in these situations, but they rarely turned into anything, and that even if they did try something, I was protected. The law was on my side. She asked me how the documents were coming along, if I'd managed to gather everything. I said yes, it was all ready, that I could bring it to her the next day. She said that was great, that she'd prepare the final paperwork, and that we could sign by the end of the week if everything went smoothly. By the end of the week. In just a few days, the land would be protected forever. Jordan and Ella could threaten all they wanted, but they wouldn't get a thing. The decision would be irrevocable. But before the week was out, something happened that I never saw coming. It was a Thursday evening. I was in the kitchen, making some tea, when I heard a knock on the door. It wasn't loud like Jordan's knock. It was hesitant, almost shy. I thought it was strange, because I wasn't expecting anyone. I went to the door and looked through the peephole, and what I saw took my breath away. It was Ella's mother, a woman I'd only seen once, at the wedding, and with whom I hadn't exchanged more than 2 words. She was standing on my porch, alone, with a look of discomfort on her face. I opened the door slowly, not knowing what to expect. The woman, whose name was Margaret if I remembered right, took a step back when she saw me, like she wasn't sure I'd let her in. She said she needed to talk to me, that she'd come alone, without Ella knowing, that there were things I needed to hear before I made any decisions. I hesitated. It could be a trap. It could be another attempt at manipulation, but there was something in that woman's expression that made me trust her, something genuine, something I didn't see in her daughter. I invited her in. We sat in the living room, one on each end of the sofa, with a safe distance between us. Margaret was visibly nervous. Her hands were trembling as she clutched her purse in her lap. And then she started talking, and what she told me changed everything. She said that Ella wasn't who I thought she was, that her daughter had a history I didn't know about, that before Jordan, she'd been married twice. 2 short marriages, both to men from wealthy families, both ending in divorce, with Ella walking away with generous financial settlements. Margaret said she tried to warn Jordan when the relationship got serious, tried to tell him the truth about her daughter, but Ella found out and threatened to never let her mother see her future grandchildren. Margaret, afraid of losing her daughter and the grandchildren she dreamed of having, kept quiet. But now, she said, she couldn't stay quiet any longer, because what Ella was planning to do to me was too much. It was too cruel, and Margaret didn't want to be an accomplice to it. I asked what, exactly, Ella was planning, and Margaret looked at me with eyes full of tears and said, "Mrs. Williams, my daughter doesn't want the land to build condos. She wants to sell it for a quick profit and then divorce your son. The marriage, the project, all of it. It's a scam. Jordan just doesn't know it yet. A scam. The whole marriage was a scam. Ella didn't love Jordan. She never had. She had chosen him because of the land, because of the 40 acres she knew he would one day inherit. Her plan was to convince me to sell, take the money, and then leave Jordan with empty pockets. I was in shock, paralyzed. unable to process what I was hearing. Margaret continued. She said Ella had massive debts. Debts no one knew about. Gambling debts, shopping debts, credit card debts. She was desperate for money, and my land was the solution she'd come up with. I asked why Margaret was telling me this. Why now, after everything? And she started to cry, really cry, with her body shaken and her voice breaking. She said she was tired of watching her daughter destroy lives, tired of staying silent, tired of being an accomplice. She said I seemed like a good person, a person who didn't deserve what was happening, and that even if Ella never forgave her, she needed to do the right thing just once in her life. We sat in silence for a long time, me processing the information, Margaret crying softly on my sofa. Finally, I asked what she thought I should do, and Margaret wiped her tears, looked at me, and said something I didn't expect. Protect yourself. Do whatever you need to do to protect yourself and your land. My daughter will not stop until she gets what she wants, unless you stop her first. She left shortly after that. She asked me not to tell anyone about her visit, said if Ella found out, it would be the end of their relationship. I promised I'd keep her secret. After she left, I sat in the living room for hours, staring at the wall, thinking about everything she'd told me. The marriage was a scam. Ella was a professional con artist, and my son was the victim. But he had also kicked me out of his wedding. He had threatened me with a conservatorship. He had chosen his wife over his mother. He was a victim, yes, but he was also an accomplice. And in that moment, I made a decision. A hard decision. Maybe the hardest of my life. I wasn't going to tell Jordan. I wasn't going to warn him about Ella. I wasn't going to try to save him. Because he had made his choice. He had chosen not to listen to me. He had chosen to treat me like an enemy. And now, he was going to have to live with the consequences of that choice. My only obligation was to protect the land. To protect my family's legacy. To protect the promise I had made. And that's exactly what I was going to do. The next day, I took the documents to Patricia Albright's office. She reviewed everything, prepared the final papers, and scheduled the signing for the following day. And that night, as I looked out my window at the trees my granddaddy had planted, I knew I was ready. Ready to end this once and for all. The day of the signing dawned gray. The kind of overcast morning that seems to fit with heavy decisions, you know? Like the sky itself knew something important was about to happen. I woke up at 5 in the morning, even though I'd set my alarm for 6. I couldn't sleep anymore. Anxiety was poking at me from the inside, turning me over in bed, making me stare at the dark ceiling while 1,000 thoughts raced through my head. I got up before the sun and went to make coffee. The house was absolutely silent, just the sound of the coffee maker and my own heart beating way too fast. I sat at the kitchen table with the mug between my hands, feeling the warmth of the liquid through the porcelain, and I thought about everything that had led me to this moment. 70 years of family history, 3 generations of sacrifice, a promise made to a dying man. And now, in a few hours, I was going to make a decision that would change everything, that would protect the land forever. But that would also mean losing my son for good. Because I knew that when Jordan found out what I'd done, it would be the end. There would be no going back, no reconciliation. The bridge between us would be burned, definitively, irrevocably. I went out to the porch with my coffee and looked at the horizon. The sun was just starting to peek out from behind the clouds, painting everything orange and pink. The 40 acres stretched out before me, still covered in the morning mist. The trees, the creek, the barn, everything my family had built, everything I was protecting. I took a long shower, put on my best clothes, the same dress I'd worn to church for Joseph's funeral. It seemed fitting, because in a way, this day was a funeral too. The funeral of the relationship with my son. At 9 o'clock, I was on the road. An hour-and-a-half drive to Durham, to the lawyer's office. I put a gospel CD in the car's player and sang along for most of the way. Not because I was happy, but because singing helped me not to think too much. It helped me stay calm. I got to the office about 20 minutes early. The secretary offered me some water and asked me to wait in the conference room. I sat in the same chair where I'd sat on my first visit and stared at the stack of papers on the table in front of me. There it was, the document that would change everything. Page after page of legal language, full of terms I didn't fully understand, but whose meaning was crystal clear. This land would never be sold. It would never be developed. It would never belong to anyone but the land itself. Patricia Albright walked into the room promptly at 11 o'clock. She was wearing a dark suit, very professional, with that serious but kind expression I'd come to associate with her. She sat in the chair across from me and asked how I was feeling. I told her the truth. Scared, sad, but determined. She nodded as if she understood exactly what I was going through, and she started to explain the documents one more time, line by line, clause by clause. She wanted to make sure I understood every detail before I signed. The Conservation Trust was irrevocable. Once signed, there was no turning back. The land would be managed by an environmental conservation organization, which would ensure it remained rural land forever. I would keep the right to live there for the rest of my life. But when I died, the property would pass definitively to the trust. No heir, present or future, would have any claim to it. No heir. That included Jordan. The lawyer asked me, one last time, if I was sure. If this was really what I wanted. If I understood that there was no going back. I looked at her. I looked at the documents. I thought of my granddaddy, working 2 jobs for 12 years to buy this land. I thought of my daddy, keeping the promise his whole life, even in the hardest of times. I thought of Joseph, asking me never to sell, his voice weak and his eyes full of tears. I thought of Jordan, kicking me out of his wedding, threatening me with a conservatorship, treating me like an obstacle, and I said yes, I was sure. This was what I wanted. The pen felt heavy in my hand, heavier than it should have. Every letter of my name seemed to carry the weight of generations. But I signed. I signed every page, every document, every clause. When I was done, Patricia gathered the papers and said she would file everything that afternoon. In a few hours, it would be official. The land would be protected forever. I thanked her for everything, for her help, her patience, her support. She shook my hand and said it had been an honor, that it wasn't every day she met such a strong woman. I left the office feeling strange. Relieved, yes, but also empty. Like a part of me had been left behind in that conference room. The part that still believed things could be different, that my son could change, that we could reconcile. That part was dead now, buried along with the papers I had just signed. But there was one more thing I had to do. One thing I'd been putting off, but couldn't avoid any longer. I had to tell Jordan, not out of any legal obligation. The lawyer had explained I wasn't required to inform him of anything, but I felt I owed it to him, not to justify myself, not to apologize, but to close this chapter once and for all, to look my son in the eye and tell him the truth. I took out my cell phone and looked at the screen. I had about 12 notifications, missed calls from Jordan, text messages from Ella, emails with urgent in the subject line. I had ignored everything for the past few days, focused on preparing the documents. But now, it was time to face it. I thought about Colin, but I didn't want to hear his voice. I didn't want to give him a chance to manipulate, to cry, to plead. I just wanted him to know, and that was it. I sent a simple text message. I need to talk to you. Can you be at my house at 5 p.m.? The reply came in less than a minute. Finally. We'll be there. We'll be there. Him and Ella. Of course she was coming with him. She wouldn't miss the opportunity to be there for this. I drove back home slower than I had on the way there. I was in no hurry. I knew what was waiting for me, and every minute of delay was welcome. I stopped at a diner on the way and had lunch by myself. I ate without tasting the food, just to have something in my stomach so I wouldn't pass out from nerves later. I got home around 3 in the afternoon. I had 2 hours before they arrived. 2 hours to mentally prepare myself, 2 hours to rehearse what I was going to say. I went to Joseph's grave again. It seemed like I was going there all the time lately, but it was the only place where I felt at peace, the only place where I could talk to someone I knew, understood me. I sat on the stone bench and told him what I had done. I said the land was protected, that no one would ever be able to destroy what his family had built, that I had honored the promise. And I asked for forgiveness, not for signing the papers, but for raising Jordan the wrong way, for not seeing the signs sooner, for failing in some way that I still didn't fully understand. The wind blew softly through the trees, making the leaves rustle. I like to think that was Joseph answering me, telling me it was all right, that I had done the right thing. At 5 o'clock sharp, the black BMW pulled onto my property. I was on the porch, waiting, standing, with my arms crossed, watching the car approach. I wasn't going to greet them at the door this time. I wasn't going to invite them in. This conversation was going to happen right here, outside, where I could see the land I had just saved. Jordan got out of the car with an expression that was a mix of relief and anxiety. He must have thought I'd changed my mind, that I'd called to accept their offer. Poor fool, he had no idea what was coming. Ella got out of the other side, perfect as always, but I noticed her smile was more forced, more tense. Something was wrong, and she knew it. They walked toward the porch. Jordan was in the lead, almost running, with the energy of someone who thinks he's won. Ella followed close behind, her heels sinking into the dirt, her eyes sweeping across the property as if she were already making demolition plans. Jordan climbed the porch steps and came to hug me. I let him, but I didn't hug him back. My arms stayed glued to my sides, stiff, as if hugging him was the last thing I wanted to do. He noticed something was wrong. He pulled away, looked at me with his brows furrowed, and asked what was happening. I took a deep breath. I looked at my son, the boy I had raised, the man he had become, and I said the words I had been rehearsing all morning. I signed the papers today. The land is in a conservation trust now. It's not yours anymore. It will never be yours. His face went blank for a second, as if the words made no sense, as if I'd spoken in another language. Then it hit him. His eyes widened. His mouth fell open. The color drained from his face. He took a step back, almost tripping, and started stammering things I could barely understand. Loose words, incomplete sentences, questions that tumbled over each other. Ella reacted faster. She climbed the porch steps and came at me with a look of fury I had never seen before. The mask of sympathy had fallen completely away. Now I saw the real woman, the con artist, the manipulator, the snake. She asked what I had done, demanded that I explain, said I couldn't do this, that it was illegal, that they would sue, they would destroy me, they would prove I was incompetent. I let her talk. I let her pour out all her anger, all her frustration, all her hatred. I didn't interrupt her once. I just stood there, motionless, looking at her with a calm I didn't even know I had. When she finally stopped to take a breath, I said, in the firmest voice I could manage, "It's done. It's irrevocable. There's nothing you or your lawyers can do. The land belongs to the trust now, forever, and there's nothing in my will for either of you." Jordan was crying like a child, his face red and his shoulders shaken. He came to me, grabbed my arms and begged me to undo it, to talk to the lawyer, find a loophole, find a way. Said he'd do anything, that he'd change, that he'd be a better son. And you know the saddest part? A part of me wanted to believe him. A small, stubborn part of me still wanted him to be the boy I remembered, the boy who hugged me tight when he had a nightmare, the boy who made me Mother's Day cards with crooked drawings and declarations of eternal love. But that boy didn't exist anymore. Maybe he never really had. Maybe he was just an illusion I had created to comfort myself. I looked at my son, with the tears streaming down his face, and I told him the truth. You made your choice. You chose her over me. You chose money over family. Now you have to live with the consequences. I gently pulled my arms away from his. I took a step back, and I pointed to the car. Leave, both of you, and don't come back. Ella still tried to argue, threatened me again, talked about lawsuits, investigations, about proving I had been coerced into signing. But her voice had no strength left. It was the desperation of someone who knows they've lost. Jordan just stood there, staring at me with those tear-filled eyes. For a moment, we just stood there like that, in silence, looking at each other. Mother and son. Two people who had once been everything to each other and who were now strangers. Then he turned his back and walked away, without another word, without looking back. Ella followed him, her heels clicking on the wooden porch, her voice hissing complaints I had no interest in hearing. The BMW started. The tires squealed on the gravel. The car disappeared down the road. And I was left there, alone. On the porch of the house my granddaddy built, looking at the land my granddaddy bought, feeling the weight of the decision I had just made. I didn't regret it. Not for a second. But that doesn't mean it didn't hurt. It hurt more than anything I had ever felt in my life. More than Joseph's death. More than any loss, any pain, any sadness. Because this time, I wasn't losing someone to death. I was losing him to choice, to greed, to betrayal. And there was no one to blame but Jordan himself. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stayed on the porch late into the night, looking at the stars, thinking about the future, about what my life would be now, about what Jordan's life would be, about what would come after all of this. I had no answers, only questions. Questions that would go unanswered for a long time to come. But one thing I knew for sure, the land was safe, the legacy was protected, and no one, ever again, would be able to take that away from me. What I didn't know in that moment was that the story was far from over, that Jordan and Ella weren't going to give up so easily, and that, in the months to come, things were going to take a turn that I could have never imagined. You know what's worse than a fight? The silence after it. In the weeks that followed the signing of the trust, I lived in a vacuum. No calls from Jordan, no messages from Ella, no emails, no visits, no signs of life. It was as if they had simply vanished. At first I was relieved. I thought they had finally understood, that they had accepted defeat and moved on. But as the days went by, anxiety started to creep in. Because I knew Ella. I had seen the look in her eyes when I told her the land was in the trust. That woman was not the type to accept losing. She was planning something. I was sure of it. Dolores called me almost every day to check on me. She worried about me, all alone in that big house, dealing with everything. She offered to come stay for a few days, to keep me company, to help me not go crazy. But I told her I didn't need it, that I was fine, that I needed time to process everything. It was a lie, of course. I wasn't fine. I was a wreck. But I didn't want anyone to see it. I didn't want anyone to feel sorry for me. So I filled my days with work. Work on the land, work in the house, anything to keep myself busy. I weeded the entire garden, even the parts that didn't need it. I painted the front fence. I reorganized the pantry 3 times. I cleaned out drawers that hadn't been opened in decades. And at night, when there was nothing left to do, I'd sit on the porch and stare into the darkness, thinking, remembering, sometimes crying, sometimes just breathing, trying to find a little bit of peace. It was on one of those nights that I found the letter. I was tidying up Joseph's office, dusting the bookshelves, when I found a box I didn't remember existed. It was in the back of the closet, under a pile of old books, a plain cardboard box with no label. I opened it more out of curiosity than anything else. And what I found inside made me sit down on the floor and cry for an hour. They were letters, dozens of them. Letters that Joseph had written to me and never sent. Love letters, letters of longing, of gratitude. Some were from when we were young, before we got married. Others were from later, from our years of marriage, from good times and bad that we had lived through together. And at the bottom of the box, there was a different letter, a letter dated just a few days before he died. I opened it with trembling hands. The handwriting was weak, almost illegible. He must have written it when he was already very sick, gathering his last bit of strength to put the words on paper. The letter was for me, and what it said both destroyed me and rebuilt me at the same time. Joseph wrote about the land, about how much it meant to him, about the promise he had made to my father to take care of it forever, and about his fear that, after he was gone, someone would try to take it from me. He wrote that he knew Jordan, that he loved their son more than life itself, but that he saw things in the boy that worried him, an unbridled ambition, a tendency to value money too much, an ease with which he could be influenced by the wrong people. And he asked me to protect the land, to not let anyone, not even Jordan, destroy what the family had built. He said that, if necessary, I should find a lawyer and put the land in a trust. That was exactly what he recommended. An irrevocable conservation trust, to ensure the land would be protected forever. Joseph had thought of this years before. He had seen the danger before I did, and he had left this letter to guide me in case I needed it. I cried holding that letter to my chest. I cried with longing, with love, with gratitude, and I cried with relief too, because now I knew I had done the right thing, that it wasn't just my decision. It was his decision too. My husband's last wish, kept in a box for years, waiting for the right moment to be found. The next day, I called the lawyer and told her about the letter. Patricia Albright was silent for a moment, and then she said that was incredible, that it was definitive proof that my decision had not been made out of revenge or anger. It was a thoughtful, planned decision based on the wishes of my late husband. She asked me to make a copy of the letter and keep the original in a safe place. She said that if Jordan tried anything, it would be powerful evidence in my favor. I did as she asked. I put the original letter in a safe deposit box at the bank, along with other important documents, and I made several copies, giving them to people I trusted. Dolores got one. The lawyer got another. I wanted to make sure that, no matter what happened, that letter would never be lost. And then, a few weeks later, the storm finally hit. It was a Wednesday morning, I remember it well. I was in the kitchen making bread when I heard a car pull up in front of the house. I looked out the window and saw a man in a suit getting out of a black sedan. It wasn't Jordan. It wasn't anyone I knew. The man came to the door and knocked. When I opened it, he introduced himself as a lawyer. Didn't say for whom. Just held out a thick envelope towards me and said I was being formally served. I took the envelope with shaking hands. I opened it right there, at the door, while the lawyer waited. It was a lawsuit. Jordan and Ella were suing me. My eyes scanned the pages, trying to understand the legal jargon. A few words stood out: mental incompetence, coercion, annulment of contract. They were claiming that I was not in a fit state to make the decision to create the trust, that I had been manipulated, coerced, deceived, and that the trust should be voided, returning the property to my original will. The lawyer waited for me to finish reading and said I had 30 days to file a defense. Then he turned his back and walked away without waiting for a response. I closed the door and leaned against it, feeling my legs give way. They were fighting. They were using lawyers, lawsuits, everything money could buy. They weren't going to give up until they had tried every option. I called Patricia Albright immediately. She listened calmly and told me not to worry. She said she had been expecting something like this, that these types of lawsuits were common in family disputes, but they rarely succeeded, and that, with Joseph's letter, we had an almost unbeatable defense. She asked me to email her a copy of the lawsuit and said she would start preparing the response immediately. She told me not to talk to anyone about the case, especially not Jordan or Ella, and she told me to try to relax because this would take time, but we were going to win. Relax. As if it were possible to relax knowing my own son was suing me, that he was trying to use the justice system to declare me incompetent, to steal what was mine. But I did what she asked, or at least I tried. I continued to take care of the land, the house, my life. I tried not to think about the lawsuit all the time. I tried not to let it consume me. And as the days passed, as the lawyers exchanged papers and hearings were scheduled, I found something I didn't expect to find. Strength. Not the strength of desperation, which had sustained me in the first few weeks, but a different kind of strength. A calm, deep strength that came from knowing I was right, from knowing I was honoring my family, my history, my promises, from knowing that no matter what happened in court, I could look myself in the mirror and be proud of who I was. And it was this strength that sustained me in the months that followed. Months of hearings, of depositions, of lawyers asking invasive questions about my mental health, my cognitive ability, my motivations. It was humiliating. It was exhausting. It was the hardest thing I had ever faced. But I endured, because I knew the truth was on my side, and that, in the end, the truth always wins. What I didn't know was that the truth was going to win in a way I could never have imagined, and that, when it was all over, things would have changed in a way that no one could have predicted, including Ella. The first hearing was scheduled for a cold autumn day. The kind of day where the wind cuts through your skin and dry leaves swirl on the sidewalks. I woke up before sunrise, with my stomach in knots and my hands shaking. It wasn't fear exactly. It was a mix of anxiety and anger that I couldn't separate. Anger at being in this situation. Anger at having to prove to a judge that I wasn't crazy. Anger at my own son for putting me there. Dolores had come to spend the night with me for company. She woke up with me and made coffee while I tried to decide what to wear. It might seem silly, but I wanted to make the right impression. I wanted the judge to look at me and see a competent, lucid woman in charge of her own decisions, not a frail old woman who could be manipulated. I chose a navy blue dress, sober but elegant. The same dress I had worn to Jordan's graduation, years ago. It seemed fitting, in a sad way, as if I were closing a chapter. Dolores drove to the courthouse because I didn't trust my hands. The building was in Raleigh, one of those old stone buildings with columns at the entrance and enormous stairs that seemed designed to intimidate. I climbed those steps slowly, feeling the weight of each one. Patricia Albright met me in the lobby. She was impeccable as always, with a folder full of documents under her arm and a confident expression that calmed me a little. She shook my hand and said everything was under control, that I just needed to tell the truth and let her handle the rest. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. A few rows of wooden benches, a judge's bench, 2 smaller tables for the lawyers. Jordan and Ella were already there when I walked in. Seeing my son was harder than I had imagined. He was sitting at the table opposite mine, in an expensive suit and with a closed expression. He looked older than the last time I had seen him, more tired, thinner. There were dark circles under his eyes and a tension in his shoulders that made me want to go over there and ask if he was okay. But I didn't. I couldn't. We were on opposite sides now, literally. Ella was sitting next to him, perfect as always. But I noticed details I hadn't noticed before. Her hair was different, shorter and dull. Her makeup didn't completely hide the signs of fatigue, and she wasn't smiling. For the first time since I'd known her, she didn't have that smirk of superiority on her face. The judge entered and everyone stood. He was an older man, probably in his 60s, with gray hair and thick-rimmed glasses. He had a stern expression, the kind that doesn't tolerate nonsense. I liked him immediately. The hearing began with the lawyers presenting their cases. Jordan's lawyer spoke first. He argued that I was not in a condition to make such an important decision when I signed the trust papers. He said I had been pressured, manipulated, that I didn't fully understand the consequences of what I was doing. He asked that the trust be annulled and that the property be returned to my will, where it, naturally, should be. As he spoke, I felt the anger rising inside me. Every word was a lie, every argument was a distortion of reality. And my own son was there, listening to it, agreeing with it, letting those lies be told in his name. Then it was Patricia's turn to speak, and she was brilliant. She started by presenting the trust documents, showing that I had consulted lawyers, had medical exams, followed all the correct procedures. She showed that I had full mental capacity, attested to by 3 different doctors. And then she presented Joseph's letter. I saw Jordan's face when the lawyer read that letter out loud to the court. I saw the color drain from his cheeks, his eyes widen, his jaw drop. He didn't know. He had no idea his father had left that Joseph had foreseen everything, had advised me to do exactly what I did. Ella reacted too. She leaned towards their lawyer and began to whisper furiously, gesturing, clearly disturbed. The lawyer shook his head, looking as surprised as his clients. The judge called for silence and looked at the papers for a long time. Then he looked at Jordan and asked, in a voice that allowed for no lies, "You're telling me that your father, on his deathbed, specifically advised your mother to put the land in a conservation trust, and you still believe she was manipulated into doing this?" Jordan opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked at Ella, seeking help, but she was too busy shooting daggers at their own lawyer with her eyes. The judge sighed and said he would consider the evidence. He scheduled another hearing for 3 weeks later and adjourned the session. I left the courthouse feeling lighter than when I had entered. It wasn't a victory yet, but it was a start. Joseph's letter had changed everything. It had proven that my decision was not impulsive, not out of revenge, not the result of manipulation. It was a planned, thoughtful decision based on my husband's wishes. Patricia told me she was optimistic, that the judge's reaction had been good, that Jordan's defense was clearly shaken. She said they would probably try to negotiate before the next hearing, that they would realize they had no chance of winning and would want to avoid further public humiliation. And that's exactly what happened. A week after the hearing, Jordan's lawyer called Patricia's office. He wanted to schedule a meeting. He wanted to discuss a settlement. Patricia told me about the call and asked what I wanted to do. I thought for a moment. Part of me wanted to tell them to go to hell. I wanted the lawsuit to go all the way to the end, until I was declared the official winner, until they were publicly humiliated for trying to have me declared incompetent. But another part of me was tired. Tired of fighting. Tired of court. Tired of all the drama. I just wanted peace. I wanted to go back to my house, my land, my life. I wanted to forget that all of this had happened. I told Patricia to schedule the meeting, at least to hear what they had to say. The meeting was at my lawyer's office 2 days later. I was there, with Dolores by my side for moral support. Jordan came with his lawyer. Ella did not come. Seeing my son alone, without his wife, surprised me. In the month since everything had started, I had never seen him without her. She was always there, whispering in his ear, controlling his every move. But that day, she didn't show up. Jordan was different. Not just his appearance, which was still tired and haggard, but his demeanor. He was quiet, submissive. He looked like a lost boy, not the arrogant man who had threatened me with a conservatorship. His lawyer made the proposal. They were willing to drop the lawsuit completely. They would no longer contest the trust, no longer claim incompetence, no longer fight for the land. In return, they wanted only one thing, that I not sue them for emotional distress. I looked at Patricia. She gave a slight nod, indicating that the offer was reasonable. But before I could answer, Jordan spoke. For the first time since he had arrived, he opened his mouth and said something. He said, "Mom, I'm sorry." Just that. 3 words. His voice was hoarse, as if he were holding back tears. He didn't look me in the eye as he spoke. He kept looking at the table, at his own intertwined fingers. I was silent for a moment. Part of me wanted to accept that apology. I wanted to hug my son, tell him everything was okay, go back to being the family we had been before all of this. But another part of me knew it wasn't that simple, that 3 words didn't erase what he had done, that a mumbled apology in a meeting room didn't make up for kicking me out of his wedding, threatening me with a conservatorship, suing me. I answered with the truth. "I know you are, but sorry doesn't fix what you did." Jordan finally looked up. His eyes were full of tears. He looked so lost, so broken. He looked like the 5-year-old boy who cried when he fell off his bike. And for a second, just 1 second, I almost gave in. But then I remembered Ella, her victorious smile at the wedding, the threats, the greed, and I hardened again. I said I accepted the proposal, that I wouldn't sue them, that the lawsuit was over, but that I didn't want to see either of them ever again, that the relationship between us was over. That, to me, Jordan had stopped being my son the day he kicked me out of his wedding. Jordan swallowed hard. He nodded and said nothing more. The lawyers finalized the papers, everyone signed, and just like that, as quickly as it had begun, the lawsuit was over. Jordan left without saying goodbye. I stayed in the meeting room with Dolores and Patricia, watching through the window as his car disappeared down the street. Dolores hugged me and said I had been strong. Patricia said I had done the right thing, but I didn't feel strong. I didn't feel like I had done the right thing. I felt empty, as if I had lost something I would never find again. I went home that night, knowing that a part of my life was over forever. My son, my family, the dreams I had for the future. Everything had been destroyed, but the land was safe. The legacy was protected, and in the end, that's what mattered. At least that's what I told myself. Every night before I went to sleep. Every morning, when I woke up alone in that too big house. The land was safe, the legacy was protected. That's what mattered. The months following the settlement were strange. It's hard to explain, you know? It was like I was living in limbo. The war was over, but I didn't feel at peace. The victory had been won, but I didn't feel like a winner. I went back to my routine. Woke up early, took care of the house, worked the land, went to bed early. The days passed, one just like the other, with nothing special to mark the passage of time. It was quiet, peaceful, but it was also lonely. Dolores visited whenever she could. She brought food, news, company. She was the only person besides Margaret who knew everything that had happened. The other people in town had heard rumors, of course. In a small town, everyone knows everything. But no one knew the details. No one knew the whole truth. And I liked it that way. I didn't want pity. I didn't want people looking at me with that poor thing, her son abandoned her look. I'd rather be the mysterious old woman who lived alone on 40 acres than be the subject of gossip at church and the grocery store. But even in my isolation, news reached me, mostly through my lawyer, who kept in touch with me for updates on the trust and other legal matters. And it was through her that I found out what was happening with Jordan and Ella. About 2 months after the settlement, Patricia called me with news that took me by surprise. Ella had filed for divorce. I was silent for a moment, processing that. The woman who had destroyed my relationship with my son, who had planned everything from the beginning, who had used Jordan to try to steal my family's land, that woman was leaving him. Patricia explained what she knew. Apparently, as soon as it became clear that the trust would not be annulled, that there would be no inheritance, that the money was gone, Ella saw no reason to stay. She filed for divorce citing irreconcilable differences and demanded half of everything Jordan had. The apartment, the car, the savings, everything. And Jordan, who was already drowning in debt because of the lifestyle Ella demanded, had almost nothing to give. The BMW was financed. The apartment was rented. The savings were gone, spent on the wedding and the lawyers for the lawsuit against me. My son was bankrupt and alone. I can't explain what I felt when I heard that. It wasn't satisfaction exactly. I wasn't happy that Jordan was suffering, but I wasn't sad either. It was something in between, a kind of bitter resignation, as if I had always known this would happen, but it was still surprising to see it actually happening. Margaret, Ella's mother, called me a few days later. She wanted to tell me personally what was going on, said she felt responsible somehow, that she should have warned Jordan about her daughter before it was too late. She told me things I didn't know yet, that Ella had massive online gambling debts, that she was on several betting sites, losing money she didn't have, accumulating interest that grew exponentially. Uncle Richard, the so-called developer, wasn't even a real uncle. He was a business associate Ella had met on one of those sites, someone she owed money to who saw my land as an opportunity to recoup his investment. Everything was a lie. The condo project, the offer of money, the promises of profit. None of it was real. It was just a smokescreen to hide the real goal, take the money from the land and disappear. And Jordan had believed it. He had bought every word. He had turned his back on his own mother for a woman who had been using him from day one. Margaret cried on the phone. She apologized over and over, said she felt like a failure as a mother, that she didn't know where she had gone wrong, that if she could go back in time, she would do everything differently. I listened to her cry and felt a strange connection to that woman. We were so different, yet so similar at the same time. Two mothers who had lost their children to bad choices. Two women carrying the guilt of failures that perhaps weren't even ours. I told her I didn't blame her, that everyone is responsible for their own choices, that Ella had grown up, become an adult, made decisions no one else could make for her. Margaret was her mother, yes, but she wasn't her owner. She couldn't control what she did. I don't know if Margaret believed me, but she thanked me before hanging up, said she would pray for me and for Jordan, and wished that one day things would get better. The following weeks brought more news of Jordan's downfall. The divorce was finalized quickly. Ella got what she wanted and disappeared. I heard she had moved to another state, probably to pull the same scam on another unsuspecting man. No one knew exactly where she was, and honestly, no one cared. Jordan had to sell almost everything he had to pay off his debts. The BMW went to auction. The apartment was given back to the landlord. The expensive clothes, the watches, the imported shoes, all were sold on second-hand websites for a fraction of their original value. He lost his job, too. I don't know exactly what happened, but I heard his performance had plummeted in recent months. Absences, lateness, mistakes a professional of his experience shouldn't make. The company gave him a warning, then another, and finally fired him. My son, who had been a promising executive earning over $100,000 a year, was unemployed, divorced, and bankrupt before he turned 40. I knew all of this through third parties, from the lawyer, from Margaret, from mutual acquaintances. Jordan never called me once, didn't send a message, didn't try to make contact. I thought he was angry with me, that he blamed me for what had happened, that he would never want to see me again. But I was wrong. It was Dolores who told me. She had a friend who worked in the same field as Jordan, and this friend had news. Jordan was living in a rented room in the suburbs of Charlotte, working a temp job that barely paid the bills. And, according to this friend, he had changed completely. He was no longer the arrogant, ambitious man Ella had molded. He was someone else, quieter, more humble, more lost. The friend said he barely spoke, barely ate, barely existed. It was as if he were just waiting for the days to pass, without hope, without plans, without anything. When Dolores told me this, I felt a pang in my chest. Despite everything that had happened, despite all the anger and all the hurt, Jordan was still my son, the boy I had raised, the baby I had nursed, rocked, loved more than my own life. I couldn't just ignore that he was suffering, but I also didn't know what to do. Call him? After everything that had happened? After I had said I never wanted to see him again? After he had tried to rob me, have me declared incompetent, put me in a nursing home? I spent nights awake thinking about it, talking to Joseph at the cemetery, praying for guidance, trying to find an answer that made sense. And then, one spring morning, when the flowers were beginning to bloom and the birds were singing in the trees my grandfather planted, a letter arrived. It was from Jordan, a handwritten letter, on plain paper, with no decorative envelope, no formalities, just words, lots of words, pages and pages of words that I read crying on my porch. He apologized, not the quick, empty apology he had mumbled at the settlement meeting. This was a real apology, detailed, specific, painful. He acknowledged every mistake he had made, every cruel word, every petty action, every moment he had chosen Ella over me. He wrote about Ella, about how she had manipulated him from the beginning, about how she had slowly pushed him away from me, planting distrust, creating conflict, about how he only realized the truth after she was gone, when it was too late. He said he didn't expect forgiveness, that he knew he had lost the right to be my son, that he would understand if I never wanted to speak to him again, but he needed to write that letter. He needed to get everything he was feeling out. He needed to at least try to apologize, even if it was useless. And at the end, he wrote something that made me cry more than all the rest. Mom, you were right about everything. About Ella, about the land, about what really matters in life. I was blind, and I hurt the person who loved me most. I don't know how to fix what I broke. I don't know if it can be fixed. But I want you to know that I understand now, and that I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I read that letter 3 times. By the 3rd time, I was sobbing so hard I could barely see the words through my tears. And then, I did something I hadn't planned on doing. I picked up the phone and called my son. My hand was trembling as I held the phone. Jordan's number was still saved in my contacts, even after everything. I never had the heart to delete it. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. I almost hung up thinking he wouldn't answer when I heard a click and then his voice. Hello? It was a different voice than the one I remembered. Softer, more tired, more empty. There was none of the arrogance from before, none of the over-the-top confidence Ella had built up in him. It was the voice of a defeated man. For a moment, I couldn't speak. The words got caught in my throat, stuck between anger and love, between hurt and longing. I just breathed, trying to find the right words. Jordan, I finally said. I got your letter. Silence on the other end of the line. A long, heavy silence filled with everything we hadn't said for months. Then I heard a sound that broke my heart. Jordan was crying. It wasn't a quiet, controlled cry. It was a real cry, with sobs and ragged breaths and sounds that came from the bottom of his soul. He tried to say something, but the words came out broken, mixed with the sobs. I could make out pieces. Sorry, didn't mean, love you, so stupid. But it didn't matter. I didn't need the words. The crying said it all. I let him cry. I just stood there, on the other end of the line, listening to my son fall apart. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. Sometimes the best thing you can do for someone is just be there, even if it's only through a telephone. After a long time, the crying started to slow down. Jordan calmed down bit by bit, his breathing returning to normal. When he could finally speak again, his voice was hoarse, exhausted, but clearer. He said he didn't expect me to call, that he'd sent the letter thinking I'd just throw it away without reading it, that he didn't think he deserved a response, let alone a phone call. I told him I almost didn't read it, that I almost did throw it away, but something made me open that envelope, something I couldn't explain. Maybe it was Joseph, wherever he was, pushing me to do the right thing. Jordan let out a sound that could have been a laugh or a sob, I wasn't sure. He said his father would have been so disappointed in him, that if Joseph could see what his son had become, he'd never look him in the face again. And I told him the truth. Your father loved you more than anything in this world. He would have been hurt by what you did, but he would have forgiven you, because that's what parents do. We forgive. We were quiet again, but it was a different kind of silence now. It wasn't heavy or uncomfortable. It was a silence of processing, of absorbing, of healing maybe. I asked him how he was doing, really doing. Not the polite question we ask out of habit, but the mother's question that wants to know if her child is eatin' right, sleepin' right, survivin'. Jordan told me. He told me about the rented room that was smaller than the kitchen in his old apartment, about the temp job in a warehouse, moving boxes for minimum wage, about the nights he could barely sleep, replaying every mistake he'd made, every wrong choice, every person he'd hurt. He told me about Ella, too, about how she'd changed after the wedding, how the masks fell away one by one, revealing the real person underneath, how he started to realize slowly that he had married a stranger, a predator who only saw him as a source of money. But by the time he realized it, it was too late. She'd already driven a wedge between us. She'd already poisoned his mind against his own mother. She'd already convinced him that I was the enemy, the obstacle, the problem to be eliminated. And he believed her. That was the worst part, he said. He believed her. He chose to believe every lie, every manipulation, every distortion of reality, because it was easier than facing the truth, because he wanted Ella to be the person she pretended to be, because he was so in love, so blind, so desperate to believe he'd found the love of his life, that he ignored all the signs. I listened to it all in silence. I let him talk, vent, get everything out that he'd been holding in for months. That's what he needed. And that's what I could give him in that moment. When he finally stopped talking, I asked a question that had been on my mind since I got the letter. What do you want, Jordan? What do you really want? He didn't answer right away. He thought about it, searching for the right words. And when he finally answered, his voice was small, almost a whisper. I want my mom back. I want to come home. Come home. The house where he grew up, the land where his father was buried, the place he had tried to destroy, to sell, to turn into a luxury condo complex. Now he wanted to come back. I didn't say yes or no. I told him I needed to think about it, that it wasn't a decision I could make on a phone call, that he had hurt me too much for me to just open my arms and pretend nothing had happened. Jordan said he understood, that he wasn't asking me to pretend anything. He was just asking for a chance to prove he had changed, a chance to rebuild what he had destroyed. I told him I'd think about it, and I hung up. I sat on the porch for hours after that call. The sun set, the sky grew dark, the stars came out one by one, and I just sat there, staring into space, thinking about everything. My son wanted to come home, the boy I had raised, who had turned his back on me, who had tried to rob me and have me declared incompetent. That boy wanted to come back. And the question that wouldn't leave my mind was I ready to let him come back? Part of me wanted to say yes immediately. That was the motherly, instinctual part, that loved Jordan despite everything, that wanted to protect him, care for him, make sure he was okay. But another part of me hesitated. That was the part that remembered every humiliation, every threat, every moment I felt betrayed, abandoned, discarded by my own son. That part didn't want to risk getting hurt again. And there was a third part, too. A part I didn't like to admit existed. The part that was angry, that wanted Jordan to suffer a little longer. That thought he deserved all the misery he was going through. That felt a bitter satisfaction in knowing he had lost everything. I wasn't proud of that part, but it was there, and I had to deal with it before I made any decision. In the days that followed, I did what I always do when I need guidance. I prayed. I prayed a lot. I asked God to show me the right path. I asked Joseph to give me a sign. I asked my mother, my father, my grandparents, everyone who had already passed on, to help me do the right thing. And the answer came from an unexpected place. I was cleaning the house when I found an old photo album. An album I hadn't seen in years, full of pictures of Jordan as a child. Him at 1 year old, taking his first steps. Him at 3, smiling with his front teeth missing. Him at 6, on his first day of school, with a backpack bigger than he was. And there in the middle, there was a photo that made me cry. Jordan must have been about 8 years old. He was sitting on Joseph's lap, on the porch of this very house, watching the sunset. They both had their backs to the camera, so you couldn't see their faces, but you could see Joseph's arm around the boy. You could see Jordan's head resting on his father's chest. You could see the love, even without seeing their faces. On the back of the photo, there was a note in Joseph's handwriting. Teaching my son to love this land. Teaching my son to love this land. But the land wasn't the lesson. The land was just the setting. The real lesson was something else. It was about family, about legacy, about the things that truly matter. And in that moment, looking at that picture, I knew what I had to do. Jordan had lost his way. He'd forgotten the lessons his father tried to teach him. But maybe it wasn't too late. Maybe he could still learn. Maybe by coming back to this land, he could find the path he had lost. I picked up the phone and called my son. Jordan, I said when he answered, come home. Jordan arrived on a Saturday morning. I was on the porch, just like I was for all the important moments in this story. It seems that porch had become the stage of my life, the place where everything happened. The place where I got Joseph's marriage proposal. The place where I learned he had died. The place where I kicked out my son. And now, the place where I would welcome him back. He didn't come by car. He came by bus, because he didn't have a car anymore. He got off at a stop about 2 miles away and walked the rest of the way. I saw him appear at the end of the dirt road, carrying a backpack and pulling a rolling suitcase behind him. It was everything he had in the world. As he got closer, I noticed the changes. Jordan had lost a lot of weight. The expensive suit had been replaced by worn-out jeans and a simple t-shirt. The Italian shoes had given way to old sneakers, and his hair, which he always kept impeccable, was too long and uncut. But the biggest change was in his eyes. The arrogant, ambitious eyes, full of a confidence that bordered on hubris. Those eyes were gone. In their place, there was something different, something humble, something broken, something that, despite everything, was still seeking redemption. Jordan stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. He stood there looking at me, not knowing what to do. He looked like a dog that had been abandoned and was now begging to be taken back. I walked down the steps slowly. Each step was a decision. Every inch I moved closer to him was a choice I was making. The choice to forgive. The choice to try again. The choice to believe that people can change. When I reached him, I stopped. We looked at each other for a long moment without saying anything. So much to say, but no words seemed enough. It was Jordan who broke the silence. He said, his voice failing, "Thank you for giving me another chance." I didn't answer with words. I opened my arms and hugged him. He was bigger than me, taller and wider, but in that hug he seemed small again. He seemed like the 5-year-old boy who would run to me crying after falling off his bike. I felt his body tremble, felt his tears wet my shoulder, felt years of pain dissolving in that moment. We stood like that for a long time, hugging at the entrance of the house where he had grown up, crying together everything we hadn't cried apart. When we finally let go, I looked into his eyes and said something that needed to be said. I forgive you, but forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. We have a long road ahead. Are you ready for that? Jordan nodded, said he was ready, said he would do whatever it took, said he would prove he deserved this chance. I believed him. Not completely, not yet, but enough to try. The first few days were awkward. We moved around the house like two strangers, careful not to bump into each other, not to say the wrong thing, not to open wounds that were still healing. Jordan slept in his old room, which I had kept the same all these years. The walls still had posters of bands he liked as a teenager. The bookshelf still had his high school basketball trophies. It was like a museum of a life that no longer existed. During the day, he worked the land. Not because I asked him to, but because he wanted to. He would wake up early, sometimes before me, and go out to the fields. He weeded, planted, fixed fences, cleaned the barn. Hard, physical labor that left him exhausted at the end of the day. I found it strange at first. Jordan had never liked working the land. As a teenager, he complained every time Joseph asked for help, said it was for poor people, that he was going to college and work in an air-conditioned office, that he would never get his hands dirty with soil again. But now, getting his hands dirty with soil seemed to be exactly what he needed. It was as if the physical labor was a form of penance, a way to pay for the mistakes he had made, a way to reconnect with something he had lost a long time ago. The weeks went by. We slowly got closer again, like two wounded animals learning to trust again. Short conversations turned into long ones. Silent meals turned into meals with stories. The strange became familiar again. Jordan told me more about his marriage to Ella, things he hadn't told me in the letter, the manipulations he only realized after she was gone, the times she threatened to leave if he didn't do what she wanted, the constant fear of losing her that made him agree to anything. And he told me about the wedding night, about what really happened. Ella had given him an ultimatum. Either I left, or she would call off the whole party. Said she couldn't pretend to be happy with her mother-in-law around, that my presence was ruining her day, that if Jordan really loved her, he would do as she asked. And Jordan, cowardly and in love, chose his wife over his mother. He said he knew at that moment he was wrong, that as he walked to my table, as he asked me to leave, a voice inside him was screaming at him to stop. But he ignored it, because he was more afraid of losing Ella than of losing me. I listened without interrupting. I let him talk, let him cry, let him apologize again and again. And when he finished, I said the only thing that mattered. You're here now. That's what matters. They were simple words, but they were true. The past couldn't be changed. The wrong choices couldn't be undone. All we could do was move forward, one day at a time, building something new on the rubble of what had been destroyed. And that's what we did. Slowly, the house came back to life. It was no longer just me alone on 40 acres. It was me and my son, working together, eating together, existing together. It wasn't perfect, far from it. There were hard days, days when the hurt came back, days when I looked at Jordan and remembered everything he had done. But there were good days too. Days when we laughed at something silly, days when he surprised me with a gesture of affection, days when I saw the boy I remembered shining through his tired eyes. About 3 months after Jordan came back, I made a decision. The land was protected by the trust. That wouldn't change. But I realized that protecting the land didn't mean it couldn't be used for something good. Something bigger than me, bigger than Jordan, bigger than our family. I started researching. Educational programs, nonprofit organizations, community projects. I wanted to find a way to use those 40 acres to make a difference in other people's lives. And I found it. An organization in Charlotte worked with children from low-income families. Children who had never seen a farm, never touched real soil, never seen where the food they ate came from. They were looking for a place to hold educational camps, a place where children could learn about agriculture, about nature, about things most city people have forgotten. I offered my land. The organization was thrilled. They sent representatives to see the property, made plans, drew up projects. In a few months, the first group of children arrived. I'll never forget that day. 20 children, most of them black, most from families who barely had money for food, getting off a bus on my property. Their eyes wide, their mouths open, their squeals of excitement when they saw the trees, the creek, the animals. Jordan helped welcome them. He showed them the vegetable garden, taught them how to plant seeds, explained how the irrigation worked. I saw his face as he talked to those children, and I saw something I hadn't seen in a long time. Purpose. My son had found a purpose. Not in money, not in status, not in expensive cars and luxury apartments, but in doing something good for other people. In using the land he had almost destroyed to build something of value. And I knew in that moment that we were going to be okay. It wasn't a fairy tale happy ending. Real life doesn't work that way. There was still a lot to sort out, a lot of wounds to heal, a long way to go. Jordan could never erase what he had done, and I could never completely forget. But we were trying. Day after day, step by step, we were trying to rebuild what had been broken. And maybe in the end, that was enough. A year passed. A year since I signed the trust papers. A year since Jordan lost everything and came home. A year since we started rebuilding, brick by brick, the relationship that was almost destroyed forever. I was on the porch, as always, watching the sunset. But this time, I wasn't alone. Jordan was sitting next to me, in the chair that used to be Joseph's. We weren't talking, just looking at the horizon, watching the sky change color as the sun disappeared behind the trees. It was one of our new rituals. Every evening, when the day's work was done, we would sit there and be silent together. No words were needed. The presence was enough. A lot had changed in that year. The educational program had grown beyond what I expected. What started with 20 children on a weekend now hosted groups every week all year round. We had built a small structure with bathrooms and a kitchen to better accommodate the groups. Volunteers came from Charlotte and other cities to help. Old Monique's farm, as the children called it, had become a landmark in the region. Jordan became the program coordinator. He organized the visits, welcomed the children, planned the activities. He had found a calling he never imagined he had. And most impressively, he was good at it. The children loved him. The volunteers respected him. The parents sent thank you letters that we hung on the kitchen wall. My son had transformed. He was no longer the greedy, arrogant man Ella had molded, nor was he exactly the innocent boy I remembered from childhood. He was someone else, someone more mature, more humble, more real, someone who had been through the fire and come out different on the other side. We never spoke of Ella again after those first few months. She had disappeared completely, probably running scams in other places, destroying other lives. But for us, she had ceased to exist. She was a closed chapter, a name that no longer needed to be spoken. Margaret, her mother, kept in touch with me. We talked from time to time, two old women sharing stories and laments. She never saw Ella again. Her daughter had cut all ties after the divorce, disappearing without a trace. Margaret lived with that pain, the pain of having lost her daughter to a person she herself did not recognize. Dolores continued to be my rock. She visited us once a month, brought gifts for the grandnephews she would never have, helped in the kitchen when there was a big event at the farm. She was proud of me, she said, proud of the way I had handled everything. The lawyer, Patricia Albright, had become a friend. We talked regularly, no longer about legal matters, but about life. She told me about the difficult cases she faced. I told her about the educational program. It was an unlikely friendship, but a genuine one. And Joseph? Well, Joseph was still with me in other ways. I still went to his grave every week. I still talked to him as if he could hear me. I still felt his presence in important moments, as if he were there, invisible, watching over everything. That evening on the porch, as the sun finished setting, Jordan turned to me and said something that took me by surprise. He said, "Mom, I need to tell you something." I looked at him, waiting. His tone was serious, but not worried. It was the tone of someone who has something important to share. He said he had met someone, a woman, a teacher who worked at the school where the children in the program came from. They had started talking, going out, getting to know each other. It was something new, he emphasized. Nothing serious yet, but he wanted me to know because he didn't want to hide anything from me. Not anymore. I asked what she was like. Jordan smiled, a smile I hadn't seen in a long time. The smile of someone in love. He said she was different from any woman he had ever known. Simple, genuine, unpretentious. She didn't care about money or status. She cared about the children, about her work, about making a difference. And she knew the whole story. Jordan had told her everything from the beginning. Ella, the scam, the lawsuit, the reconciliation with me. She knew everything and was still there. I asked if I would meet her. Jordan said he hoped so, that he wanted to bring her to see the farm, to meet his mother, to see the land that meant so much to their family. But only when I was ready. No pressure. I said I was ready. And so, a few weeks later, I met Sarah. She was everything Jordan had described and more. A woman in her 30s, without exaggerated makeup, without designer clothes, without that air of superiority that Ella exuded. She arrived at my house with a shy smile and a homemade cake she had baked herself. We sat on the porch, had coffee, and talked for hours. Sarah asked me about the history of the land, about my veteran grandfather, about Joseph, about everything. She listened with real attention, with genuine interest. She wasn't measuring how much it was worth or calculating how she could benefit. She was simply present. When she left, I turned to Jordan and said, "I like her." He smiled again. That smile of someone who has found something precious. "Me too, Mom. Me too." The months went by. Jordan's relationship with Sarah grew. She started coming to the farm frequently, helping with the program, talking to me, becoming part of our life. And slowly, I began to realize that she was truly different, that it wasn't a mask, that her love for my son was real. One spring day, Jordan asked me to go to Joseph's grave with him. He said he needed to do something important and wanted me to be there. We walked across the property to the top of the hill where Joseph was buried. The sun was shining, the birds were singing, the wind blew gently through the trees. It was a perfect day. Jordan stopped in front of his father's headstone and stood in silence for a moment. I waited, not knowing what to expect. Then he began to speak, not to me, to Joseph. He told him about everything that had happened, about the mistakes he had made, about Ella, about the scam, about the lawsuit against me. He apologized to his father, just as he had apologized to me. He said he had shamed his memory, that he had betrayed everything he had taught him, that he didn't deserve to carry his name. And then he took a small box out of his pocket. It was a ring, an engagement ring. Jordan said, still looking at the headstone, that he had found a good woman, a woman his father would have approved of, and that he wanted his blessing to ask her to marry him. I was crying before he even finished speaking. The wind blew stronger at that moment, making the leaves of the trees rustle. I like to think that was Joseph responding, giving the blessing his son asked for. Jordan turned to me, his eyes also full of tears, and asked if I gave my blessing too. I hugged my son there, on top of that hill, surrounded by the land my family had fought to acquire. And I said yes. I gave my blessing, that Joseph would have given his too, that I was proud of the man he was becoming. The wedding was 3 months later. Small, simple, on the porch of my house. The same porch where I had received Joseph's marriage proposal 40 years earlier. The same porch where I had kicked out my son a year before. Now it was the porch where he began a new life. Sarah was beautiful, in a simple white dress she had sewn herself. Jordan was nervous, stuttering through his vows, dropping the ring twice. But the love between them was palpable, real, true. I was in the front row, between Dolores and Patricia. Margaret had been invited too, and she came, even knowing that her daughter was the reason for so much pain. We exchanged a look during the ceremony, a look of understanding, of solidarity between two mothers who had been through so much. When Jordan and Sarah exchanged rings, I looked at the land around us, the 40 acres my grandfather had bought with 12 years of labor, the trees he had planted, the barn my father had built, the house where I had lived my whole life. Everything was protected now. The trust ensured that this land would never be sold, never be developed, never be destroyed. It belonged to nature now, and to the memory of all who had lived there before me. But more than the land, what was protected was the legacy. Not the legacy of money or property, the legacy of values, of family, of love. The Jordan who almost destroyed all of this was the same Jordan who was now rebuilding. He had hit rock bottom and had come back, different, better, more like the man Joseph always wanted him to be. And me? I was at peace, not a peace of someone who has forgotten the pain. The scars were still there, and always would be, but a peace of someone who has learned to live with them, of someone who understood that life isn't about avoiding pain, but about what you do after it passes. Today, as I tell you this story, I am sitting on that same porch. The sun is setting again, painting the sky orange and pink. Down below, in the field, I see Jordan and Sarah playing with their grandson, my great-grandson, a 2-year-old boy who has his great-grandfather's eyes and his mother's smile. They named him Joseph. Sometimes, when I look at that little boy running on the land his great-great-grandfather bought 70 years ago, I wonder what the future holds for him. What challenges will he face? What choices will he have to make? What mistakes will he make and what lessons will he learn? I don't know the answers. Nobody does. Life is like that, full of uncertainties and surprises. But one thing I do know, he will have this land, not to sell, not to develop, not to turn into money, but to walk on, to play on, to grow up on, to learn where he came from and who the people were who fought for him to be here. And maybe, when he's older, someone will tell him this story. The story of his great-grandmother who almost lost everything, but who fought to protect what mattered. The story of his grandfather who lost his way and then found himself. The story of a family that was almost destroyed by greed, but was rebuilt by love. Is it a story with a happy ending? I don't know if there's such a thing as a happy ending in real life. Life goes on, problems arise, nothing is perfect forever. But it's an ending of hope, an ending of new beginnings, an ending of peace. And now I have a question for you. If you were in my place, what would you have done? Would you have forgiven Jordan? Would you have let him come back? Or would you have kept him out of your life forever? I know a lot of people will say I was a fool, that I should have told him to go to hell and never looked back, that what he did is unforgivable, and I understand that point of view. I really do. There were times when I thought that way too. Times when the anger was so great that I wanted him to suffer for the rest of his life. But you know what made me change my mind? A simple question I asked myself. If I didn't forgive, who would suffer more? Jordan would suffer, of course, but so would I. I would live the rest of my life carrying that weight, that resentment, that anger. And in the end, the one who would be a prisoner wasn't him. It was me. Forgiving wasn't easy. It wasn't quick. It wasn't a magical moment where the pain suddenly disappeared. It was a long, difficult, painful process. A process that I'm still living, actually. Because forgiving isn't forgetting. It's choosing every day not to let the past control the present. And it's a choice I would make again. So that's it. That's my story. The story of how my son tried to rob me, how I fought to protect what was mine, and how we found our way back to each other. Thank you for listening to the end. It means a lot to me to know that someone cares about the story of an old black woman from the countryside of North Carolina. Now tell me, where are you listening from? What's your city, your state, your country? Write it down in the comments. And if this story touched you in any way, leave a like for the video. It helps the channel continue to bring more stories like this, stories of real people, with real problems, finding real paths forward. And if you haven't subscribed yet, go ahead and subscribe now. There's a little button down there, just click it. It costs nothing and helps a lot. Oh, and before you go, look at the screen. There's another story there that I'm sure you'll like. It's about another woman who went through a tough time and came out on top. Click on it and watch. I'm sure you won't regret it. Thank you for the love, y'all. Truly, you make an old lady very happy. Until the next story.